Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am joined today by Professor and economist Richard Wolff to discuss the state of the US and the world economy. Professor, we have guess we can start by outlining what is the state of the US economy these days. Over the past at least 3 decades, we've seen the debt levels balloon really at a time when the US, I guess, should have imposed greater fiscal discipline. But how serious is the economic trouble that we're entering?
Well, let me jump to the punchline and then go backwards and explain how I get there. Um, as you can tell from my hair, I am older. Uh, I was born and raised in the United States. I've worked here and lived here all my life. This is the worst condition of the American economy in my lifetime. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life. I am a product of the elite universities of the United States, um, where they tried very hard and with a number of very good teachers to persuade me that capitalism was the best possible economic system the human race could achieve, and that my job was to go out, explain that to people once I had my PhD, so as to reap all the benefits that this marvelous economic system would deliver. They tried very hard to persuade me, but they did not succeed. In my education, I asked many questions, and they did not provide me with sufficient answers. I want just to let you know I'm coming from a critical perspective about capitalism. Over the last 4 decades, we have lived through in the United States a massive redistribution of wealth and income from the bottom and the middle to the top. The names of Americans these days uh, that are known around the world tend to be names like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or Elon Musk or Jeffrey Bezos, etc., etc. The billionaire class here in the United States. And if you ever wanted to understand their importance, well, then go look at pictures of the inauguration of President Trump, where he had sitting behind him on the platform the richest billionaires he could gather, half a dozen people. So, the first thing to understand about the American economy is that after almost a century and a half of building up its quote unquote middle class, the defining itself as a successful middle class country that had only a few poor people at one end and a few very rich people at the other, but that it was of, by, and for the vast majority of a middle class. It went so far as to make those who loved this arrangement refer to the United States as a genuine classless society, and to boast that it was more that than, say, the Soviet Union, their Cold War enemy. It may be difficult to sustain a society as extremely unequal as this one is economically. But it is even more difficult to do that if you have built up an ideology of American exceptionalism built around the notion of a huge middle class. That huge middle class is gone now. And the people of this country know it. And they are angry and bitter and disappointed, and many of them are filled with rage. That created the opportunity for demagogic politicians, which our country generates all the time, to find rich soil in which to cultivate what? The scapegoating that would feed the upset. The people want to know what is the problem? What happened? Why is the middle class I was born into not here anymore? Why is the middle class I was hoping to introduce my children to no longer available to them? And we have the demagogues offering the explanations. Number one, horrible immigrants. Rather remarkable in a country composed almost entirely of immigrants, having killed all the people who were here before the Europeans arrived. Immigrants. Number two, black and brown people. Number three, women. And number four, foreigners, any foreigners, whether they're here or overseas. Mr. Trump is the president because he knew how to speak to, how to mobilize this population around its economic grievances. And he did it by focusing them on other issues that would at least allow their rage to be expressed. So suddenly we can have serious people tremendously agitated at the thought that a man in the process of becoming a woman or vice versa might be able to use a bathroom not initially designed for them. We have serious debates on that subject. Okay. What are the economic implications? Well, you mentioned one, the extraordinary debt of this country. And let me spend a moment on that with you. The level of debt of our government is at records we've never seen before. Roughly the numbers $35 trillion in debt, $25 trillion in GDP. That is a serious issue in most countries. We've never had this kind of level of debt before, and it's in peacetime, relatively speaking. We are not in a major war. We are always in small wars, but we're not at the level of World Wars One and Two. And yet we are running deficits in the trillions of dollars year after year. So the government is at record debt. What is little less well known is the fact that our corporate debt is also at record level. We have never had a corporate sector, business sector, in as much debt as it is now. We have roughly 20% of our corporations that have been labeled zombie corporations. Why? Because they are unable to make enough money to pay their debts. And the only way they keep going is to borrow more to pay off the debt they already have. No one knows how to handle this. We sit there, we see it. There's nothing secret about any of these statistics. And all I can tell you is it's not a sign of health. And finally, our homeowners, our households, are also in record levels of debt. And I can only add to you that the level of delinquency, which is measured here, if your debts are unpaid for more than 90 days, 3 months, then you are considered delinquent. And our delinquent rates on credit card debt and so on are at record highs. Our people are mired in four kinds of debt. The biggest one is mortgage debt. Americans who own their own homes do not own those homes. Banks own the homes, and the people in them pay the bank a monthly mortgage, which is a payment that covers the debt they had to go into to buy the house plus the interest on that debt. That's the biggest. Second biggest, automobile loans. Americans cannot afford neither their home nor their automobile, so they borrow. The third is credit card debt for all daily purchases. And the fourth is student debt. When I was a student here, people borrowing money was the relative exception. Now, people borrowing money to get a bachelor's degree is the norm. The only difference is before a bachelor's degree guaranteed you a job, now it does not do that anymore. So if you look at the debt and what it gets you, we are a level of debt beyond words. The last thing, and then I'll stop. Otherwise, I'm like a wind up toy. I just keep going. The last thing is, in a way, the most important. The American Empire, which replaced the British Empire about 100 years ago, give or take, rose for most of the 20th century, and it is no longer rising. It is now declining. Wherever you look, the portion of global exports the United States accounts for is significantly less than it was 30 or 40 years ago. The portion of imports in the world that the United States accounts for, same thing. The role of the dollar among other currencies, same thing. The decline is everywhere. It goes together with a military decline. I know that may strike you as bizarre, but we are very conscious here that we lost the war in Vietnam, we lost the war in Afghanistan, we lost the war in Iraq, and we are in the process of losing the war in Ukraine. This is understood now. Other countries, particularly Russia, have done better in updating and building their military than this country. And the United States empire is falling. It's over. It cannot do and it cannot afford what it used to. It's not bringing in the looted wealth of the rest of the world the way it once did. Around the world, central banks are reducing the use of the dollar as a reserve against their own currency. The dollar is still important, but not the way it was 20 years, 40 years, 60 years ago. The Japanese yen, the European euro, the Chinese yuan are becoming replacements, as is gold. The extraordinary rise of the price of gold by about 50% over the last 2 or 3 years is a testimony to the decline of the dollar because it is leading all kinds of holders of wealth to shift out of dollars and into, among other things, gold. So I think you can see almost everywhere the decline of an empire, weakening an economy, and a weaker economy making the decline of the empire that much stronger. This is a very dangerous period. Last point. Here in the United States, the major response to everything I've just said, and much more that could be said along the same lines, has been what psychologists call denial. That is, and I assume this is not so unusual among declining empires all the way back to Greece and Rome and everything since. It's very difficult to look at your own empire when it is declining. It's much more pleasant when it's on the way up. And so we have denial, which means we don't discuss in any serious way at all that we're in a period of decline and that imposes on us different decisions, different policies, different strategies than those that we used in the 20th century when it was going up. So, for example, in the just concluded presidential election between Trump on the one hand, Biden and Harris on the other hand, not a word about a declining empire. Not at all. No hint of it. No reference to it. Nothing on either side. It cannot be spoken in this country except for the growing number of us who are speaking it. And the irony here is, I am doing more public speaking in the United States now than at any point in my life because people are now open to and interested in hearing even my kind of explanation for what it is that's going on. Last thing, if you're wondering why the economy looks as chaotic now as it often does, well, that's a symptom of what we're. Everything I've just said should give you the background to understand it. We can no longer afford friendship, even on our northern border with Canada or our southern border with Mexico. The nation of the U.S., is busy saying you have to be accruing wealth to us more than you have, or else we will punish you. We will put a tariff on you. We will do this. We will do that. It's a society disintegrating, and everybody, the ruling groups in every country, are trying to figure out how to hold on to the wealth they have accumulated at a time when the larger economy is having a harder and harder time maintaining itself, let alone growing. Therefore, you need also theater, political theater. We are not declining. We are not shrinking. We are not poor. We are not. And you can see that as the president announces that he's going to make Canada the 51st state. He's going to snatch the Panama Canal. He's going to grab Greenland. What is this about? This is about demonstrating that we are in the opposite position of where we really are. Those should be seen for what they are, acts of desperation.
There's something strange about how capitalism, well, the ideology of liberal economics or capitalism has changed a bit because if you go back in the day, people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, I mean, the real poster boys of economic liberalism, they were again very cautious and worried about the rent-seeking process. That is when you have someone extracting wealth without contributing to the production process, and they were concerned about oligarchy. They were more in favor of industrial capitalism, in which the government would actually tax these rent seekers, build infrastructure to elevate, uh, yeah, common, well, yeah, elevate the standard of living, making the economy more competitive. But we don't see much of this anymore. Indeed, Adam Smith, he wrote a lot about morality. He also warned that the economic inequality between the Europeans and the rest of the world created a system of more extraction and exploitation. David Ricardo recognized that with each technological innovation, there was a tendency to concentrate more of the wealth in the capital owner as opposed to labor. And he worried that this would cause economic inequalities over time. As you pointed out, this would then lead to political instability, exploitation. So they used to discuss these things, but now their ideas have become the the drumbeats of free market liberalism. It's quite strange to see how this has advanced. But I wanted to ask you about Trump's alleged effort to turn this whole thing around. I mean, one of the two things he's doing now, of course, is with Musk. They have Doge, which is yeah, these dramatic budget cuts, but also tariffs as a very powerful weapon to yeah, to, well, I guess historically it has had some purposes in terms of defending domestic industries, but also renegotiating trade deals. However, it appears to use it very heavily as a weapon as well. Also, of course, using economic coercion against adversaries. Do you see any future in this or any ability to turn things around, or is this just going to make the matters much worse?
Well, to be fair to Mr. Trump, we tend, and this may be true in Europe too, I don't know. We tend to give the political leadership the idea that they are very powerful and they can shape economic development. I don't think they can. I'm much more persuaded that economic development shapes these politicians than the other way around. On the one hand, that frees them. I can't criticize them so much because I don't give them the power that they want us to think they have. So Mr. Trump understands much of what you just said in some way. But let me give you two or three reasons why skepticism is in order. Number one, I did a little research and I can show you that 11 of the last presidents we've had, Bush, Clinton, Obama, all of them, each of them promised to bring manufacturing back to the United States. There is absolutely nothing new in Mr. Trump making the same promise. The problem is the other 11 never succeeded in doing it. Everyone promised it, no president delivered it. That means the odds against Mr. Trump are heavy, number one. Number two, much of what Mr. Trump does is exaggerated political theater. And he does it because it got him into office. The theatrics of the rage, of being a white supremacist, of being an enthusiast for guns, for being an opponent of abortion. He just went further than previous Republican Party candidates in doing those things because it spoke to the rage of the base. And that worked. That got him to be the president. He's continuing it now, but it's mostly theater. I'll give you the example that's up in the forefront of America now. Utilizing Elon Musk, which is a huge mistake, but put that aside for a moment. Utilizing Elon Musk, he is firing tens of thousands of federal civilian employees. Let me give you the background. The federal government employs 2.5 million civilian employees, another 2.5 million military employees, a total of 5 million federal employees. State governments in this country, the 50 states together, employ 5 million civilian, twice as many civilian employees as the federal government. And the lowest level of government, city, town, village, employ 15 million people. If you wanted to become more efficient among public employees, your first choice would be the local. What is he doing there? Nothing. The second choice would be the state. What is he doing there? Nothing. The third choice would be the federal government, which only has 2.5 million employees. It's those that is firing. Second aspect, if you go back to the 1960s and you ask how many federal employees, civilian, were there then? Answer, 2.5 million. In other words, over the last half century, When the population of the United States has gone up by more than 100 million people, the number of civilian employees of the federal government hasn't changed. In economics, that's called more efficient, not less. There'd be no reason to choose them. This is political theater meant to terrify the working class, which it is doing, meant to allow the government to show less money spent. That pleases the ruling class because it means we're not going to tax you as much as we otherwise would. But it's all small potatoes. It doesn't deal with any of the real problems. And now, finally, the tariffs. That's more political theater. Let me explain. I'll take one of the biggest examples. The automobile industry, very important in American life for obvious reasons. The automobile industry has changed over the last 30 to 40 years, basically because of technology, travel expenses, and NAFTA, the agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. not to interfere in movement of people and goods across the border. As a result, if the United States levies tariffs on Mexico and on Canada, it will mean that most of the cars brought into the United States and the import of cars into the United States is a very large part of our automobile business. They will all become much more expensive because they will have to pay multiple tariffs since the way the cars are constructed, you do one part in Mexico, you ship it to Canada, they do another part, then they ship it to the US, does another part, goes back to Mexico. Very complicated. Okay, let's assume that a tariff is imposed. What is already happening to Mexico and is in the process of destroying the Mexican economy is the deportation of immigrants. We are deporting millions of immigrants. Try to understand millions of people pushed back into Mexico where there are no jobs for them. Number two, when you deport these Mexicans, they no longer earn the money here that they can send back to their families in Mexico, remittances. So we send them workers for whom there are no jobs, and we cut back on the remittances, which were, at last I looked, about 15 to 17% of GDP in Mexico. And now you're going to put tariffs that take away the jobs they had in the automobile industry if those people decide to move into the United States to escape the tax. This is the destruction of the modern Mexican economy, and roughly the same is happening to Canada. What kind of a country creates turmoil? Half of Mexico is run by drug gangs already. We're talking about the collapse of the other half. Okay. This is not a sign of health. This is a sign of desperation. Finally, many of the companies, both in the United States and abroad, do not know what to do about these tariffs. It's important for people to understand a large corporation is not going to spend the billions of dollars needed to relocate factories and warehouses and shipping arrangements, say from Mexico back into the United States. They're not going to spend billions to do it. A year or two, which is the minimum you have to allow for this to happen. It'll take more likely 3 or 4 years. They're not going to do it because Mr. Trump has already shown that he puts the tariff on, then he takes the tariff off. For him, the tariff is a manipulation the way you do when you're a real estate dealer, which is what he was, bargaining over some piece of property. The property stays there. You threaten this, you threaten that. That's the game. He's playing that game as Mr. Politician. But the reaction of the business community is we have to wait and see. We have to wait whether the tariff is maintained. And by wait, they mean months or years. And if it's years, Mr. Trump will likely be gone, given his age, given that this is the second of the two terms he has. You have no, and he's such a chaotic character. I give you an example. Earlier this week, the TikTok Corporation, a very important corporation owned by Chinese nationals, is under pressure from Mr. Trump to have the Chinese leave and be replaced by Western European or American owners. They haven't worked out a deal yet. Mr. Trump wants this deal, so here's what he said. If we can get a deal in the next 30 days, I might be willing to reduce or cut the tariffs on China. Well, if China is the major enemy of the United States and he's willing to withdraw one of the few tools he has, then how secure are any of the other tariffs? The answer is they're not. There is now widespread prediction of a recession coming to the United States this year because businesses are holding back investments because of the chaotic nature of all the talk about tariffs. The result is it doesn't look like Mr. Trump will be any more successful in bringing manufacturing back. We've had 40 years of a financialization, neoliberal globalization program. And that's enough time, 40 years, for American corporations to have moved massive operations to China, to India, to Vietnam, to Brazil, and so on. And those parts of the world are the growing, dynamic parts of capitalism. Why should a company come back here? Last point. If the tariffs are permanent here, there will be retaliation. And the retaliation, whether it's in Europe or Canada or Mexico or Asia, will cumulatively hurt the United States. It doesn't understand that because it thinks it's in the 20th century and it can do this without fear of retaliation. But China and the BRICS are real economic competition. We have not had that for a century, and we don't know how to recognize it, and we don't know how to handle it. And the result is what you see.
I think that's an excellent question. It also takes me to my final question because I see the same in Europe. That is, after all these decades, we've economic coercion kind of been a one-way street, and the idea that sanctions is something we do against others. Now that we see economic coercion and sanctions going the other way, we have to come up with new words for it. So hybrid warfare, and well, it's we have to find words which are not legitimate, as opposed to the legitimate words, which would be, yeah, sanctions. But there is yeah, a real yeah, discomfort about how the economy shifted so rapidly from the west to the east. Uh, but during the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9, you saw something fascinating happening in the discourse both in China and in Russia, which was they both kind of lost a bit trust in the ability of the United States to continue to lead the international economic system for much longer, because the way they saw it, the US and got into trouble for borrowing and spending too much. So to get out of trouble, they borrowed and spent a bit more to get the economy running. So again, the lack of fiscal discipline. This is something that this is when the Chinese really began to roll out the Belt and Road Initiative, this new industrial policies, their own development banks, and of course the Russians with their, well, to a lesser extent, their equivalents. But how do you see? Because unlike 2009, there weren't really any viable alternatives. And you did mention BRICS, but to what extent do you see the China, Russia, and the other uh, great powers? You can put India in that category too, of course. Creating now alternatives, and to what extent are they going to be able to, uh, if not not put themselves in harm's way, but at least create some alternatives in the financial or economic problem which we're currently entering?
Well, my own view, and I see it around me too, so it's not unique to me at all. But my own view is that that issue has been resolved. I mean, I look at China and the BRICS, and I do a few very basic calculations. That's over. If you add Indonesia, the last huge country to join the BRICS, that's over half the population of this planet. The United States is 4.5% of the population. And that should stop you right in your tracks. What are you talking about? There is, if you add up the GDP of the BRICS countries, it's about 35% of global GDP. The G7, United States and its major partners, is much less than that, 27, 28% of global GDP. It means that every African, Asian, Latin American country thinking of borrowing money, of opening its markets, of finding new export outlets, they used to go to Washington or London or Paris or something. They still go there, but when they're done, they send the same delegation to New Delhi or Beijing or Sao Paulo, and they play one against the other, which is of course what they should do. And they're getting a better deal very often from the Chinese. And so it's the Chinese who build the railroads all over Africa. These are all signs that the wiggle room, the maneuverability of the United States. Here's the irony. At the end of World War II, a leading intellect in this country, George Kennan, coined the term containment, that the strategic objective of the United States was to contain Soviet socialism or whatever it is you want to call the Soviet Union. And so the ring of bases all around the Soviet Union, the NATO as an alliance, SEATO, all of that. Here's the irony, very Hegelian. The United States is what's becoming contained now. It's the whole rest of the world that's isolating the United States. If you look at the recent United Nations votes, it's the world against the United States and Israel. I mean, how much more isolated could you possibly be? And the calculation in Ukraine, I want to, I know you follow that material, but in the early months of 2022, there were these statements from Biden and Russia to its knees, ruble will collapse. All of that was nonsense and wrong. Why? They didn't understand that if you throw sanctions, or what they called the mother of all sanctions, against the Russians, they could turn to their BRICS allies, and that would really make a difference, which it did. An enormous difference. And not just India and China, important as those countries being so big obviously were and are, but all of them in little way. The tanker that goes from some nondescript Latin American country into Europe, if you look closely, it's carrying Russian oil. This is a game. But to evade sanctions, it's helpful to have a lot of friends and allies in the right place. That's what BRICS is. You can't just count it as, the numbers. It's all of the relationships that are emerging that the United States is either unable to control or unable to win when it tries to control, but China or India try something else. That used to go for the United States. Now it doesn't. These are all signs that what's coming to the United States and what may be important for you to see is a moment of truth, what the French would call un denouement. You're going to have to make a decision either to sit down and work something out with China and the BRICS or keep going on this collision course. You have been trying to contain China at least for the last 15 years, probably longer. It doesn't work. How much longer are you going to go? How long will the Seventh Fleet play games in the South China Sea? How long the fantasy of Taiwan? How long the chip competition, which the U.S. is losing? The This is incredible, and for Europe, I mean, you are being ground together by two stones that are struggling to figure out how to make their relationship. And what they're both figuring out, I don't mean to frighten people, but they're both figuring out the lubrication would be to watch Europe sink into nothingness, into a place where people go who are looking for tourism and not much else. Uh, and if that can be done, if they can divide up Europe between them, that may make the deal sweeter for both of them. And then they can have this historic moment where Europe's 1,000 years of domination come to an end. It sure looks that way from here. And Mr. Trump and the leadership, they express hostility towards Europe that is, even for me as an American, astounding. They have already decided to sell Europe out, and they won't even charge very much to do it.
Yeah, there is when you spoke about America not wanting to recognize the decline of empire, there's a similar development here in Europe. That is, after all of these centuries of being the subject of security, no one wants to admit that we are now the object, that we are the pieces. No, we don't have a seat at the table. We are the pieces being moved around on a board, and it's yeah, no, it's quite remarkable to watch, and when you have things like Biden taking out the Nord Stream or Trump threatening to take Greenland, the first impulse is to run and make excuses for it. That it's not so bad, and let's not ruin our relationship with our masters in Washington. So
Yeah,
it's quite troubling to watch.
yeah, and it should. And in order to make it, I don't want to leave people depressed, and I really don't. Here are some, for a moment. The labor movement is moving again in the United States in a way it has not for 75 years. That is a very positive sign. It's slow, it's hesitant, but it's militant. And above all, the youngest people are the one most determined to change the labor movement in a very clearly progressive way. And the same is true of young people pretty much across the board. They don't carry the baggage of the past the way the older ones do. The Cold War is a memory they don't even have, so that all of that is kind of gone. Uh, I'm known, for example, with the label Marxist. And that's only because I respect what I learned from the Marxist tradition, and I'm not about to deny it. It makes no sense. I don't take that seriously. But I'm now okay. The Marxist perspective is now a perspective in the United States that people are interested in learning about. We haven't had that for 50, 75 years. All of this is very new for us and all very, very positive. We have people who self identify as socialists who are winning elections all over the country. still at a low level, at the city council, the mayor, here and a member of Congress. But we used to have that, Bernie Sanders saying I'm a socialist used to be a political suicide act. It's not anymore. Mr. Sanders is going around the country in the last 2 weeks, having bigger crowds than he's ever had. These are all signs. People should be aware. There's a big opposition in the United, very big. What it isn't is organized. That is the real defect here. We don't have a tradition of socialist or communist or anti-capitalist or other kinds of political organizations on the left that mobilize people. We don't have that's being constructed. That's our fault. That's our weakness. But in terms of consciousness, no, the consciousness of the left here is in quite a good position.
Professor Wolf, thank you so much for your time. I hope, yeah, I can have you back here on this channel someday.
Absolutely, I'd be glad to do it.